Well, I know most of you are familiar with Harper's Ferry National Park, but I can almost bet that none of you've been where we are right now. We are in the national park, and we're at Harper's Ferry. You can tell that by the mountains. But this is an angle that you maybe have never seen before. It's a very, very different place. We're actually standing on Bolivar Heights. Remember the three edges of the triangle, and one edge I said was Bolivar Heights. Bolivar Heights is the lowest of the three mountains that surrounds Harper's Ferry. Think of the bottom of my triangle as Bolivar Heights. Well, it's the lowest of those three ridges. It's much lower than Maryland Heights, probably about 800 feet lower than Maryland Heights. It's a good 300 feet lower than Loudon Heights. So it's the bottom, but it's not the bottom. The bottom is where the rivers come together in the gap itself, where the rivers have carved their way. The Potomac and Shenandoah carved their way through the Blue Ridge. That's the lowest point. And incidentally, Harper's Ferry is the lowest point in the state of West Virginia. Only 276 vertical feet above sea level, Harper's Ferry. Well, Harper's Ferry's out there. You can see the gap. But I wanted to stop here for a moment because, again, focusing on infantry, there's two sides to this infantry story. Now, we've already talked about what the Confederate mission is. The Confederate mission is to place infantry on tops of the mountains. Well, what about the Union mission? What about the Federals, the defenders? What are they going to do with their infantry? Well, keep in mind that Colonel Miles, the commander of the Union garrison here, the Railroad Brigade at Harper's Ferry, 14,000 men at his disposal. Now, not all those 14,000 are infantry. Might be able to hear that. A little whistle in the background. Maybe you heard. That's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Right underneath of us, literally. There it is, whistle blowing again. So listen for that in the background as he comes through the gap. And so Miles, Colonel Miles, 14,000 at his disposal. About 12,000 of those are infantry. A little less, let's say between 11 and 12,000. So the bulk of his garrison is infantry. Does Miles know that they're coming? Is he aware of Special Orders 191? The answer is no. He doesn't know anything about 191. But he knows the rebels are focusing on Harper's Ferry. He knows they're coming from three different directions. How does he know? Cavalry. His cavalry's out there scouting very aggressively, probing, and watching Confederates coming from these three different directions of the compass towards the mountaintops. So again, Colonel Miles is very aware that he is a target, that the enemy's coming at him from three different directions. And Miles is no dummy. He's no idiot. The man's a West Point graduate. He spent 42 years in the infantry, and he's a colonel. He was a full colonel in the regular army before the outbreak of the war. And we could count the total number of full colonels on two hands. Double. That's it. There weren't many regiments. There weren't many colonels. Miles outranks Robert E. Lee in the regular army. He outranks most men that later will become very famous. Dixon Miles does. He's colonel of the 2nd U.S. Infantry regulars when the war breaks out. But now here he is in command of about 14,000 men. He knows how to use infantry, knows how to deploy infantry. That has been his life, literally. His life for his country is utilization of infantry in defense of and protection of the United States. And so Miles, with his force, knowing about the triangle, he's been here since the end of February, so he knows this place very well, decides to deploy. Now, how would you do this? What would you do? How would you defend three different mountains if you know the Confederates are coming at you from three different directions? How would you do that? Well, this isn't hypothetical or theoretical for Miles. He's got the enemy coming. Oh, and there's one more thing about Colonel Miles and his infantry. It's not just a matter of deployment. His infantry, we often think about what's the composition of these men. Are they veterans? How many battles have they been in? What kind of casualties have they taken? Are they experienced? Are they hardened fighters? Miles doesn't have that advantage. Most of the men that are here with him in that garrison are raw recruits, brand new soldiers. Most of them have only been wearing a uniform for 3 weeks. Most of them were given their gun, their rifle, only 3 weeks ago. They've had no time to practice, no time to drill. There's no such thing as boot camp. They haven't been to boot camp and then assigned here. These men, most of them, answered President Lincoln's summer call for more volunteers. You know, Lincoln put out that call for 300,000 and then 600,000 volunteers, new men. Gotta have you, gotta have you. So they answer the call. They're doing their patriotic duty. But they don't have any experience. They are truly raw recruits. Miles, in fact, there were so many of them that were sent here, Miles would write to his superiors in Washington and complain that he was becoming nothing more than a camp of instruction, like a boot camp. That's not what he signed up for. So that's what he's got at his disposal. Not very many veterans here. But he still has to use what he's got, knowing he has no support coming, he's got no reinforcement, he's completely isolated, and his final words that he received before the telegraph lines were cut, you will hold Harper's Ferry until the last extremity. Now this man, 42 years in the Army, knows how to take an order from a superior. Last extremity. So Miles is at disadvantage. Oh, there's one other thing you should know about Colonel Miles. He's outnumbered. He's outnumbered. 2 to 1. 30,000 Confederates coming here. Miles has 14,000 men total. It's one of the few times during the Civil War where the United States Army is outnumbered. We don't usually think of that. So Miles has terrible disadvantage here. But his one great advantage, he knows the ground. He's very familiar with this place. He's been here a long time in 1862. So, remember my triangle? Remember I said that the highest edge of these 3 mountains is Maryland Heights? Well, there it is. You've got to hold Maryland Heights. You must maintain that position. You lose Maryland Heights, you yield the high ground to the enemy, well, you're done. You're finished. Plus, that's his main escape route. If Miles gets into trouble, he's not thinking about escape. I mean, hold until the last extremity. There's no word in there about escape. But if he has to get out, where are his friends? Well, they're not in Virginia. They're that way. They're in Maryland. So that's where he'll find allies if he has to get out of here. And the only way he can get out is by holding Maryland Heights. Miles knows this. So he's going to take, ultimately, about a third of his troops, and place them on Maryland Heights. Now you might say, well, why doesn't he put all of them up there? Well, remember that we have 3 positions to defend simultaneously to hold Harper's Ferry. So you just can't put everybody up on Maryland Heights. So about a third of the force goes up on the high ground there. We'll talk about his deployment of the rest of his forces in a moment, but I want to show you something from here that's very, very important. If you look here at that near ridge, the one closest to us, in front of the cliffs, in front of the gap. You see that? It's right over here to the right. You can see a gap in the trees, and you can see, if you look carefully, you can see what looks like a ridge, a bulk of trees on high ground in front of the gap. And then if you look really carefully, you'll see a slope. You'll see it sloping downhill rapidly, precipitously, to the what would be your left of that clump of trees. Well, at the bottom of that slope is the Potomac River, going right into the gap. It's flowing from where we are towards the gap. This is important. That slope is a hill. There's a 4th hill I didn't tell you about. There's a 4th hill. So here I have my triangle, and in the middle of that triangle, a bullseye in the middle of that triangle, is another hill called Camp Hill. Camp Hill. Now this is important in understanding the infantry defense of Harper's Ferry. You maybe never heard of Camp Hill, but you've been on it. People that come to Harper's Ferry are on Camp Hill and don't even know it. But Camp Hill is the first elevation from the lower town. When you're down in the old town where the two rivers come together, and you start to climb. Let's say you're making the climb towards the Harper House. You're climbing Camp Hill. You've gone up the stone steps. You're climbing Camp Hill. You go to Jefferson Rock. You're climbing Camp Hill. You continue a little bit further, and you come to the Harper Cemetery. You're climbing Camp Hill. That's all Camp Hill. I've said those two words a lot here in the last minute. Well, there's a reason for that. Dixon Miles saw Harper's Ferry defended against another Confederate attack by Stonewall Jackson. And he saw it defended successfully. What the heck am I talking about? Jackson's Valley Campaign, May 1862. A lot of people don't think about Harper's Ferry in that campaign. They should, because this was the only place in the Shenandoah Valley that did not leave, depart, or retreat in the face of Stonewall Jackson in May of 1862. Harper's Ferry held. It held. Now Jackson came here. He was here. He was here with his forces. The end of May. And the Yankees defended the place. And the main infantry defense was on Camp Hill. Jackson outnumbered the Yankees in 1862 just like he does now. But you see, what they did in 1862 is they concentrated their infantry on this hill in the middle of the triangle. Right there it is, with its flanks protected. Its flank protected here on Potomac River. Look at that steep flank. I mean, even Jackson wouldn't attempt to go up that. And Camp Hill's not wide. It's only about half a mile across. And on the other side is the Shenandoah River in the flank, just as steep as the one you see behind me. And so very steep flanks hold the top of the hill, and that's what they did in 1862 in May during Jackson's Valley Campaign. As Jackson was advancing, he had to stop, stall, and could not advance any further because the Federals had a strong infantry defense behind entrenchment on Camp Hill. And they held in May of 1862, and Miles witnessed that. So that's an important part of our infantry story, is this Camp Hill defense. Now, as the summer of 1862 advances, the Federals are going to reinforce that position with a major fortification, earthworks, and put artillery there, 20-pounder Parrott rifles pointing in our direction, because the Federals are going to extend out their infantry defense to where we are now, Bolivar Heights. But that becomes their backup line. Camp Hill becomes the line that they can withdraw to and secure if they get in trouble out here. We're about a mile from Camp Hill. So if we need to get out of here, we can go there and get behind those fortifications on Camp Hill, supported by those 20-pounder Parrott rifles. So Miles is going to hold Maryland Heights with about a third of his force. And he knows Camp Hill is available to him as a last ditch of defense if he needs it. So what's the secret to this plan? The secret to this plan is the enemy doesn't take Maryland Heights, because that renders Camp Hill indefensible. And there's another secret, and that is the enemy doesn't get any artillery on the mountaintops. You can defend Harper's Ferry with infantry as long as the enemy doesn't get guns, cannon on the mountain crest. You can hold this place. And Miles, who knows Harper's Ferry and knows these mountains, 42-year veteran of the Army, West Point graduate, is saying to himself, there's no way they're ever going to get cannon on top of these mountains. Not possible. So Miles is feeling pretty good, even though he's going to be surrounded momentarily, and even though he's isolated and cut off, no communications, no hope of reinforcement. He's ready for siege operations if necessary. He can hold. His infantry can hold, he's pretty sure.